In March of 1985, in Antarctica, Captain Andrei commands the icebreaker, Mikhail Somov, which successfully delivers freight to the Ruskaya Polar Station and picks up some polar explorers. The captain then sends a status report to Leningrad, explaining that difficult ice conditions had delayed their progress and that they're taking measures to reach open water as soon as possible. On the other side of the ship, a sailor warmly welcomes a group of explorers, shows them their quarters, and as they settle in, the sailor makes sure they're comfortable, invites them to watch a movie with the crew, and rushes off so that he won't miss the opening scenes. However, as he walks away, the sailor almost tripped over one of the passengers, named Leva's dog Dusha, who is excitedly running around the ship, and orders the owner to get a hold of him. As Leva runs after the dog, Dusha enjoys the chase and continues on, causing chaos, stealing food, and having fun. Meanwhile, on the deck, the captain helps his crew lift a load, but the group struggles to do so due to the wind. Then as they try their best to manage, with Lev in tow, Dusha runs towards them and distracts them. Soon the ropes break, causing the load to drop. Concerned by this, the captain quickly reacts and after making sure that they are all okay, helps them and orders them to fix the rope and reload. Unbeknownst to the captain, inside the ship, calmly watching the ordeal as if it doesn't affect them one bit, First Mate Anatoly and Second Mate Bannock arrogantly criticize the captain's hands-on methods and make fun of the fact that he's too close to his crew. Moments later, this conversation is interrupted by a more serious announcement, and the duo learns that the ship is heading straight towards an iceberg. Soon, Captain Andrei is informed of the alarming situation and hurries to the bridge to learn the details. Once there, while trying to remain calm, Captain Andrei tries to come up with a plan to avoid hitting the iceberg and gives out orders. However, only a few minutes later, all the planning goes out the window as the iceberg suddenly flips over, causing a massive wave and shattering the ice sheets. Shocked out of his mind, the captain orders his men to turn off the engines, desperately hoping to stay as far back as possible from the mayhem. But soon the waves multiply, causing terror. Outside, the crew members who are still on the deck are terrified by the shocking events, and despite their best efforts to run back, the deck is soon showered and covered by sheets of ice. While the sailors struggle to make it back inside, Dusha is overpowered by the wave and is thrown into the frozen water. Despite being terrified out of his mind and knowing that he has to retreat as soon as possible, Leva sympathizes with his beloved dog, who he knows won't survive the ordeal by himself, and just remains there trying to figure out what to do. However, moments later, the decision is made for him when, to the shock of everyone, he too is thrown off board. The crew reacts quickly, runs out to the deck, and throws a rope ladder down for Leva and gives him directions. But unfortunately, he is unable to get a hold of the ladder and drifts away. Then, despite an intense confrontation with Anatoly, who suggests they leave Leva behind and focus on steering clear of the iceberg and save the numerous people on board, the captain, who's unwilling to leave a man behind, gives orders to send a crew member named Vitaly after Leva. While Anatoly mutters threats, Vitaly is sent down into the water, but despite his best efforts, he's unable to rescue Leva, who unfortunately soon drowns. Devastated, the freezing Vitaly grabs Dusha and returns to the ship. The captain, who is heartbroken by the loss, pushes his grief aside, turns his attention to the massive iceberg they are approaching, and gives out orders to carefully get past it. However, despite taking every precaution, the ship grazes the iceberg, which once again causes momentary chaos. But to everyone's utter relief, they soon clear it and move along. Later in the dining hall, the grief-stricken group drinks to honor Leva's memory, while Vitaly, who has lost his voice during the rescue mission, goes to see the ship's doctor, Dolgov. Then after checking on Vitaly, the devastated captain heads to his quarters, hoping to clear his head and process everything that had transpired over the last couple of hours. Unfortunately, as if eager to add salt to the captain's injuries, Anatoly follows him there, stands outside his locked door, and lists all of the damage the ship had sustained during the ordeal. Anatoly then approaches Bannock, shares his decision to report the captain to Leningrad, accusing him of going against everyone's advice to launch a failed rescue mission that endangered the lives of many and caused critical damage to the ship. And once he gets the second mate's support, he heads off to make the call. Elsewhere in her apartment, Andrei's journalist wife Lyudmila tends to her young son, and once he steps out to play, with a broken heart, confides in her friend that she and the captain are getting a divorce. On the ship, a message comes from Leningrad, which, to the dismay of everyone, dismisses Captain Andrei from his command, citing managerial errors, and appoints Anatoly as acting captain until the experienced replacement, Captain Valentin, arrives in 3 weeks. To the surprise of Anatoly, Andrei calmly passes on the responsibility without any resistance and tries to stay out of his way. 3 weeks later, Captain Valentin is flown by a helicopter and approaches the ship, which the crew members notice and prepare to welcome their new captain, while Andrei packs up his belongings and prepares to leave. Then as the helicopter proceeds to land, the crew warmly bids farewell to Andrei, whom they respect and appreciate, and who in turn thanks them for being the best team. A few minutes later, the pilot Nikolai proceeds to land the helicopter on the deck, but soon catches it on fire. Nikolai somehow manages to land the chopper and runs out onto the deck. A few crew members quickly extinguish the fire and tend to the shaken man, while an unbothered Captain Valentin walks away to meet Anatoly, whom he scolds for the mess he sees on the deck, and Andrei, whom he blatantly blames for the ship's current situation and informs him that due to the damage sustained by the helicopter, he will have to remain on board until they reach Australia. The captain is then escorted to the bridge by Anatoly and rushes there while remarking on everything he sees around him. Once there, the captain screams with frustration at the mess he sees, scolds a sailor for doing the Rubik's Cube while on duty, snatches the cube and throws it outside before announcing his arrival to everyone and ordering to restart the journey ahead. Elsewhere at work, Lyudmila speaks to her boss about an article that came out which details the events taking place on the icebreaker and shares her fear that the government will use her soon-to-be ex-husband as a scapegoat, but it all falls on deaf ears. 2 weeks later on the Ross Sea, the icebreaker continues its journey, but soon it gets stuck, unable to break through sheets of thick ice. After attempting numerous maneuvers to clear their way, Captain Valentin calls a general crew meeting, stands in the back, and quietly watches as Anatoly leads it and asks for ideas. The crew members suggest a couple of ideas and make a joke which Andrei joins, and as he cracks one and makes everyone laugh, the captain becomes annoyed, calls him out in front of everyone, reminds him that he's no longer a crew member, and orders him to head back to his quarters and patiently wait for his exit. Shocked by the blatant disrespect, Bannock tries to defend Andrei and express how valuable he is to the crew, but is soon shut down. As the crew members quietly watch on, the captain reminds them that he's the only one in charge, dismisses all of their ideas, and announces that they will stay in place and wait for orders from Moscow. The captain then storms out, and as he heads to the bridge, Andrei, who's been waiting to speak to him alone, approaches him to inform him of his fear that an iceberg may be following them and offers to work with him to find a solution. Still dismissive of Andrei and blaming him for the ship's current status, the captain orders Andrei to head to his cabin while threatening to arrest him otherwise. A few days later, to the dismay of the crew, the captain informs them that they will have to wait for a rescue boat, which has already started its journey to reach them, and announces that food and power will be rationed from then on. As the ship remains adrift and the crew begins the wait, Bannock completely flips on his previous opinion, and as if he hadn't encouraged Anatoly to report Andrei, now scolds him for his actions and blames him for the arrival of the new stern captain who has started controlling everything with an iron fist. In May 1985, after not hearing from her husband for weeks and terrified for his safety, Captain Valentin's pregnant wife Galina goes to speak to the authorities, but is turned down from even entering the building, along with many other concerned families. Desperate to find answers, Galina tries to run past the security, but soon falls down, feeling ill, and is rushed to the hospital. One night on the ship, while everyone sleeps, hoping to find a solution to their precarious situation, a stressed-out Andrei quietly leaves the ship and walks around on the ice, closely inspecting his environment. Then a few minutes later, Andrei is shocked to see proof of his fear in the form of the Rubik's Cube the captain had thrown out when he arrived, and concludes that a floating iceberg is following them. Unfortunately, before he can share this discovery, Andrei falls into a hole and remains there freezing until he's later rescued by the crew, who rush him to the infirmary. There, before he can even be properly treated for his frostbite, Andrei hands the captain the cube and shares his discovery, but is soon shut down once again. Over the next few days, the relentless waiting continues, and the crew does whatever they can to pass the time. One afternoon, hoping to keep their morale up, the crew gathers and sings a song while Nikolai plays the guitar. However, suddenly frustrated by the fact that the group is seemingly enjoying themselves instead of repairing the helicopter, the captain scolds the group for their laziness, gives them some chores, and breaks the guitar so that they will have no distraction. Later, seeing the exasperation of the men, Andrei calmly scolds the captain for his poor decision and shares his suspicion that they may be out there longer than they thought. A few days later, while performing the regular physical examination, the doctor admonishes the captain's insensitivity toward the crew members, but soon calms down. Then as the duo spends a few hours getting to know each other, The doctor shares his wish that if he dies during the journey, he would like his body to remain in the freezing wilderness. A couple of days later, to make matters worse, the sheets of ice surrounding the ship suddenly start collapsing onto it and flooding the hold, ruining the food reserves and fresh water tanks. Shocked by this, the captain sends the men to tend to this while he remains on the bridge. Together with Andre, the men quickly tend to and minimize the damage. Elsewhere, despite needing surgery, a stressed-out Galena leaves the hospital against the doctor's advice and rushes home. On the ship, frustrated with the long wait for help, Andre proceeds to go live and send a Mayday alert to the entire world, but is soon stopped by an incoming message that gives them permission to break the radio silence and inform them that icebreaker Novorossiysk is coming to rescue them. Elsewhere on the rescue ship, a frustrated Lyudmila, who had asked to be relieved of the rescue mission duty to no avail, pushes her disappointment aside and gets to work taking pictures of the crew's preparation for the tough journey ahead. A few minutes later, a KGB officer named Vladimir introduces himself to her and introduces her to the crew. Later that evening, Lyudmila is distressed to find Vladimir in her cabin, going through her personal belongings, questions him, and is even more confused when, instead of explaining himself, he advises her to reconsider the divorce and try to find other ways to make her marriage work. Back on the ship, chaos erupts when Nikolai, who's frustrated out of his mind, runs out of the ship into the freezing wilderness, certain that a quick death will be more tolerable than the seemingly endless waiting. While the captain watches on from his cabin, the crew runs after Nikolai, who jumps into the helicopter to get away from the men and becomes excited to inadvertently discover that the helicopter is now fully functional. Once Nikolai calms down and is brought back inside, Anatoly gives the good news to the captain, but is frustrated to see his nonchalance. Angrily muttering to himself, Anatoly heads to look for his crew and finds them cheering Vitaly, who's playing a game. Sticking to the captain's power ration rule, Anatoly quickly unplugs the game, which infuriates Vitaly, who attacks him. Luckily, the crew swiftly breaks up the fight. Then, as the men discuss their predicament, they turn on the captain and question his decisions. Then, upon further discussion, they decide to get rid of him and follow their original plan to blow fuel and free the ship. Hence, the group storms the captain's cabin, expresses their anger, arrests him for his incompetence, and after putting Nikolai in charge of monitoring the captain, they leave to execute their plan. With Anatoly leading the way, the men then head to the bridge and order Bannock to convince the engine room crew to ready the engines. However, Bannock sternly refuses to get involved in the madness, forcing Anatoly to give out the orders himself. Meanwhile, after figuring out what's going on, a distressed Andre rushes to the captain's cabin to check on him. However, once there, the captain, who has mistakenly believed that Andre is leading the mutiny, holds him at gunpoint until Nikolai testifies on his behalf. The captain then calms down, decides to work with Andre to stop the crew from taking dangerous measures, and runs out. On the other side of the ship, the crew unloads the fuel barrel, places it on the ice, and as they proceed to blow it, the remaining crew excitedly watches on from the dining room, and after explaining to the chef that they will soon resume their journey, demand he give them celebratory meals, but fail to convince him. This soon causes a hostile argument, which quickly turns into a fight. With chaos brewing on every side of the ship, the captain, Andre, and Nikolai run as fast as they can to the bridge, where the captain holds the men at gunpoint and tries to stop them from restarting the engines. This is, however, interrupted by the sound of an explosion from outside, and soon everyone is devastated to learn that the doctor has died while trying to burn fuel. Elsewhere on the rescue ship, Lyudmila's assignment to join the rescue mission becomes clear. When hoping to shift the blame away from the government, Vladimir asks her to convince her husband to take responsibility for the death of Leva and the damage to the ship, and promises her that he won't face any prosecution other than being suspended from his duties. Seeing her hesitation, Vladimir offers the journalist a new apartment in Leningrad where she can have a fresh start with her family. Unimpressed by the bribe, Lyudmila profusely refuses to cooperate, which infuriates the agent into threatening to ruin both hers and Andre's lives should she fail to convince her husband to do as requested. Elsewhere, just like he had promised the doctor, the captain orders the crew to dispose of his body into the icy water and joins everyone in paying respect and mourning the loss before heading back to the ship. That night, feeling hopeless and knowing that even if they somehow survive the horrific ordeal, he will face prosecution and spend the majority of his life behind bars, Anatoly decides to end his misery, dons his captain's uniform, goes out to the deck, and prepares to throw himself overboard. Luckily, while he contemplates his decision for one last time, Andre appears out of nowhere, and despite the bad history between them, motivates him not to give up and fight until the end. Reluctantly, Anatoly pauses his preparations, spends hours standing outside thinking about everything, and to Andrei's relief, quietly returns to his cabin. On day 133 of being adrift and desperately waiting for help, the captain calls for a general meeting to discuss their status and learns that despite cutting down on heating, lights, and the use of electrical appliances, they have fuel that can only sustain them for 3 more days, and if help doesn't arrive in that time, they will all freeze to death. A few minutes later, the meeting is interrupted by an excited Dusha who runs into the room barking nonstop. Curious to find out what's going on, everyone follows the dog and Vitaly outside and is shocked to see the sheets of ice surrounding the ship are cracking spontaneously. Andrei calms down the distressed crew and, after reminding everyone that this is their last chance to break free, comes up with an idea to wait and see if the iceberg ahead of them will crack the ice field, start their journey, and carefully thread through the crack. The captain agrees to this and volunteers to go on the chopper with Nikolai to inspect the iceberg, while Andrei takes command of the ship. Andrei quickly gets into action, and once the ice field starts to crack, orders the crew to start the engines, and the ship finally starts moving for the first time in more than 4 months. Elsewhere in the city, Galina is admitted to the hospital, where despite being terrified for her husband's fate and wondering what will happen to her baby if she doesn't make it, she agrees to have a C-section to deliver her baby. In the wilderness, as the ship continues moving towards the iceberg, the crew holds their breath, desperately hoping they can manage to maneuver around it without crushing into it. Luckily, all their wishes come true, and despite some scares, they manage to get past it under Andrei's command. However, on the other side of the iceberg, Nikolai and the captain are relieved to see this and proceed to return to the ship, but are soon knocked off their path by the wind and crash. From the ship, Andrei and the crew become distressed when they fail to communicate with the duo, frantically trying to locate their radio signal and realize what had occurred. Then, as Andrei tries to figure out what to do, he receives a call from the rescue ship and is more gutted to learn that they won't be able to fly in time to rescue the duo. Hence, despite the crew reminding him that the captain will have all of them prosecuted for mutiny if he survives, unable to leave his comrades to their death, he starts devising a plan to rescue them before the iceberg crashes onto them. Andrei then orders his men to turn the ship around, and as they hurry to rescue the duo, the captain, who rescues Nikolai, falls into the freezing water. Luckily, the crew soon arrives and manages to rescue both men. The captain immediately assumes his post on the ship, and after thanking Andrei, sternly dismisses everyone to continue his duty. Meanwhile, the crew gathers on the deck and cheers in celebration while watching the intimidating iceberg disintegrate from a distance. A couple of hours later, Lyudmila and the agents arrive on the ship, and as the agents prepare to fuel the ship, Lyudmila and Andrei are happily reunited. At the hospital, to everyone's relief, Galina's operation goes well, and she gives birth to a beautiful baby boy. Sometime later, while the crew sails through the sunny ocean, Nikolai arrives on a helicopter carrying newspapers. As soon as he lands, the men rush to see the papers, hoping to find an update on their case. Find Lyudmila's article accompanied by their group picture, and are relieved to see no word of prosecution and realize that the captain hasn't sold them out. Hence, the crew calls the captain to thank him and honor him with a gift. And for the first time since his arrival, the captain genuinely smiles and appreciates his incredible crew.